Can I say first of all, thank you. Thank you for your nominations, thank you for your support, thank you for your trust, and thank you for the work that you do for the Labour Party and for Britain. The work you do in campaigning, the work you do in organisation, the work you do simply getting our message across. And let me start by thanking June not only for being with us today, but for the work she does for international development that is known not just in this country and in this continent, but in every continent of the world. June, thank you for everything that you do. And I want to thank Stephanie, who is the member on the National Executive for Young People. She attended my launch of my campaign a few weeks ago, and it's because of her that I managed to get 400 nominations. So thank you very much, Stephanie. And thank you, Kieran and Kenny, for the work that you do as chair and future chair of the Labour Students, work that is going now to every university and college. I want to thank you and everybody associated with Labour Students for what you do. And thank you, Richard, for what you're doing for Young Labour. Whenever we have a campaign, the purpose of it is that first hundreds, then thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then in the end millions of people come to the view that what we are suggesting is right for the country is something that we can do. And I want to thank you for running the campaign this year on child poverty, because the aim of the Labour movement is that in this generation, because of the work you do, because of the effort we make, we will abolish child poverty so that every child has the best possible start in life. And let me thank you also for the work you do campaigning on affordable housing, the work you do campaigning on student grants, and we may talk about that in a few minutes, the work that you do campaigning on student accommodation, and I know there's also a campaign that I've seen campaigning on TV licenses in student accommodation. And let me most of all thank you for what you did, many of you, in the last 2 years, campaigning on international development. It was because of what you did in Make Poverty History, because a third of young people actually wore the wristbands. It's because we had that massive demonstration in Edinburgh, 250,000 people attended. It's because 8 million people campaigned on the website that for the first time in the history of the world, we achieved total debt relief for 22 countries. More than 100 billion of debt relief was achieved. And at the same time, we committed ourselves to 0.7% as our target for international development aid. So thank you, and thank all Labour students and all people who are part of Young Labour for what was achieved, a momentous change, and I want to say something about that in a minute. When I started off as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1997, the challenges were we had to create economic stability, and we had to have growth and prosperity in the economy. We had millions of people who were unemployed or out of work, and we had to create 2.5 million jobs, which is what we've done. And we had to invest in health and education, in our public services, and we have doubled expenditure in each of these areas. But you know now, as I look at the years ahead, the challenges are very different, and they're fundamentally changed from what they were in 1997. Yes, we've got to have stability. Yes, we've got to have jobs. Yes, we've got to invest more in our public services. But in 1997, people did not understand just the huge challenge of climate change. And in the last few days, I've been talking to people in Brazil, Mozambique, in South Africa, about how we can join together to produce bioethanol fuels. I've been talking to people in the rest of Europe about how the World Bank can become a bank not just for the development of the world, but for the environment. I've been talking about how we can improve our ecology, the Congo Basin in Africa, how we can fund a project with Wangari Maathai, the Nobel Prize winner, so that we can reforest a whole part of the African desert, an African area where trees are being taken out by people illegally logging today. And so the environment and climate change and people's demand that there is sustainable development for all is the first challenge that we face for the future. A few years ago, nobody understood the challenge of global economic competition. 400,000 people will graduate from universities in Britain this year, but 4 million will graduate from universities in China and India. China is now producing half our electronics goods. China is producing more than China and Asia are producing more than Europe. And we now must meet the battle for prosperity for all in a situation where we have global economic competition and where Asia is now at the front of the table. And then, of course, the challenge of security and terrorism. Really unknown 10 years ago. but we have Al-Qaeda around the world, operating in 66 different organizations, running 5,000 different websites, tens of thousands of people involved in Africa, as well as in Asia, as well as in the Middle East, in organizations that threaten the livelihoods of many people. And so the challenge of terrorism and security is new as well. And then we have the challenge of rising aspirations. People's aspirations are higher than they were 10 years ago. And then when you talk to people, particularly elderly people, they talk about the problems they see in their own communities, and there is a yearning for stronger communities in our country. And so when you look round at the Britain that we've got to create in the years ahead, we've got to tackle climate change, we've got to tackle terrorism and security, we've got to tackle global economic competition, we've got to build stronger communities. We've got to respond to people's rising aspirations for education, to get to college and university for apprenticeships, people's rising aspirations to own their own homes, or even to have homes for rent or ownership that are simply not available at the moment. And you know, all these challenges have one thing in common, one thing that we, the Labour Party, have got to recognise. And the challenge is this: you cannot solve these problems unless you involve and engage the people of this country. You see, you can't solve the problem of climate change just by public investment and international deals. You need people themselves to make decisions about how they want to use the environment. You can't solve the problem of terrorism and security without involving people themselves in trying to persuade people that extreme views that condone violence and assassination and terrorism are simply not acceptable in a democratic society. So you've got to win the battle of hearts and minds. You can't solve the problem of global economic competition without people themselves deciding that they need the skills and need to upgrade their skills for the future. And you know yourself, you can't build strong communities in any country unless people themselves play a part in the building of these communities. And that's why we as a Labour Party in the next few years need not only to listen and to learn from people, we need to involve and engage people. We need to hold citizens' juries in all parts of the country. We need to use the internet to listen to what people are saying. We need to use all modern methods of communication to hear what people have. Every local Labour Party has got to network so that it's in touch with every civic organisation, every voluntary group, every sports, cultural, arts, religious organisation in their area. We need to be at the centre of communities and the centre of community life, listening and learning to people and involving and engaging them. And that's why our party will need to undergo major reform over these next few years. If you look at political activity in this country, only 1% of the population are members of a political party. 50 years ago, it was 10%. If you look at how people engage in political activity, it's often through pressure groups and movements for the environment or Make Poverty History that are engaging people, and we have to persuade people that the logic is you've got to take political action as well. If you look at MySpace, it's now the biggest youth club in the country, and we need to find other ways of getting through to young people. And you know, there are two challenges for the Labour Party moving forward that are absolutely essential. The first is we have got to make stronger contact and stronger connection with all our local communities. So I want there to be a duty on local Labour parties that they have connections in every area of the constituencies with all local community groups in their area. And the second thing is we've got to listen to the party members and hear what everybody has to say as we make our policy for the future. And I believe there should be a duty on the party itself to consult and to involve and engage the membership of the party as we make our policies. And whether it's discussing how we deal with drugs and antisocial behaviour, or whether it's how we deal with recycling and the environment or the international challenges of climate change, or it's how we campaign on international poverty, what we do about education, how we meet the demand for more housing, we have got to consult and listen and involve and engage every local community in the country. And that's why I will come forward in the next few weeks with proposals for party reform. In the 1980s and 1990s, because of Neil Kinnock and John Smith and Tony Blair, we made major changes in the way our party was organised, major internal reforms so that our party was brought up to date. Now we need a 21st century party to meet 21st century challenges that requires us to involve and engage ourselves in all our local communities and also to consult the membership and make them fully involved in the making of policy for the future. So the reforms and modernisation that we must bring about so that we have a 21st century party meeting the challenges of the future are about involvement and engagement. and not returning to the old ways, but moving forward to new ways of making decisions in the interests of the country. And what are the big challenges that we now have to meet in the next few years? I mentioned climate change. I mentioned that we've got to act on global economic competition. I've mentioned also that we need to do more so that young people have the chance to realize the potential through education, through college and university, and through apprenticeships. But in the week of the G8, let me just mention the other challenge. The challenge that we've been involved in together over these years, the challenge of make poverty history. I've been, as Chancellor, had the chance to visit a number of countries around the world. I went to Indonesia in 1997 and 1998, just as it was undergoing some of the worst political unrest, and saw for myself young children denied the basic chance of education. I went to Mozambique and I met mothers who were waiving the paychecks of £5 a week only, and they had to pay for the children's education because there was no free schooling, and they were asking how could they possibly get their children to school when they had to pay money for their education. I went to Kenya and I saw that when education was made free, in the biggest slum in the world, in Kibera, I saw that there were 1 million children had turned up for schooling in Kenya simply as a result of making education free. I went to Tanzania and I met young children who were telling me they wanted to go to school and why were they denied the chance of education. And I met a girl whose brother had AIDS and she wanted to be a doctor, and you knew perfectly well that she couldn't even stay on in secondary education because she had no money, far less have medical education. And the one objective that we could achieve in the next few years that is worth achieving for every child of the world is, instead of 80 million children not going to school tomorrow, every child has the chance of education. And I want us, the Labour Party in Britain, to lead a campaign that involves all countries of the world over the next year and years, so that we achieve that Millennium Development Goal, that every single child in the world, for the first time in history, we'd be the first generation to do so, has the basic right to education, and it is a basic right that all of us should honour. And I went to... Gandhi, who was the leader of India, said, if you're ever in any doubt about what you should do, if you ever have any doubts about what your course of action should be, recall the face of the poorest and frailest and weakest person you've met, and then you'll be in no doubt what to do. And when I went to Africa a few months ago, I met a young girl, Miriam, and she was 12 years old, and her mother had died of AIDS, and her father had died of AIDS, and she was one of the 12 million orphans of Africa. And I talked to her about how she felt. She's been moved from house to house because she had no close family. She wasn't even able to go to school. She herself was suffering from HIV. I thought and I knew that she had tuberculosis as well. And you looked in the eyes of a 12-year-old and you saw not the hope and not the joy and not the expectation about the future, but someone who was totally desolate. And that convinced me we had to do something else in the next few years. And we are the generation that can actually do this. We have to eradicate diseases like tuberculosis and polio and diphtheria and malaria and pneumococcus. All diseases where we have the medical knowledge, we have the science, we have the technology, but what's been lacking is the resources and the political will to save lives. And there are 30,000 children who will die tomorrow, dying every day, because we do not provide the resources and they have not the medical treatments to enable them to live. So the second objective for the next few years, which we can meet as part of the Millennium Development Goals, is to get the resources, the drugs, the treatments, the capacity, so that we can say that this is the generation that has eradicated the diseases that are killing 10 million children around the world. And I believe that this is the generation that can do it. 200 years ago, Britain abolished slavery. We were the first country to do so. It happened as a result of a popular campaign. People said at the time it was impossible to do it. They said we were just dreamers. They said all the people that were demonstrating were impractical. It could never be done. How could you even begin to think you could abolish something that was happening in all parts of the world, and Britain could say that it should have no longer any part of it? And then 150 years ago in Britain, because of people who campaigned, we were one of the first countries where every child had free education. And then 50 and 60 years ago, we were the first country to have free healthcare as a result of a campaign of people who could no longer stand the idea that nurses had to raise money in charity flag days to pay for vital health equipment. And at each point, people said it was impossible. It was a dream, it wouldn't work. It was unrealistic to think you could have healthcare that was free at the time of need. It was unrealistic to end child labor and say that every child should go to school. And then in the 1990s, Nelson Mandela was released from prison. And people had thought he'd been in prison for the whole of his life. Apartheid came to an end. And one of the great evils of the last generation was brought to an end by popular pressure. And people had said before that happened that we were dreamers in thinking that was possible. And the same thing is true of education for every child in every country of the world, of eradicating the diseases that kill so many children unnecessarily and avoidably in every part of the world. And we could be the generation that turns what some people say is an impossible dream into something that means that every child in the world and every family can get the benefit of the right to education and healthcare. So as a Labour movement, I believe we should have confidence that our values are indeed the values of the British people, and have confidence that in these next 10 years, we can meet all the challenges that are ahead of us. We are the only party that is thinking ahead with policies that make sense of the future. We can make a contribution not just to a just society in Britain, but a society based on justice in every part of the world. Thank you very much.